Without further ado, we will get on with our presentation. We're really excited to hear from Orchid tonight. Orchid Black teaches the Native Palette and Sustainable Garden Practice classes at UCLA Extension. She lectures widely on California native plants, is active in CNPS, and is the owner of Native Sanctuary, a garden design practice. Orchid, take it away.
Welcome, everyone. Give me just a minute to share my screen. Oh, and I see that some of my students are here. Hello, Sarah. Hello, George. If I miss you, we can chat later. Okay. Okay, I need the option to share my screen.
Apologies.
No problem.
That should do it.
Okay, let's try that again. And back. Let's see, I think this looks like the end, but maybe it will start at the beginning. Okay, hold on. While I stop the share and talk amongst yourselves for just a second while I figure out what I didn't do correctly. And
if anyone does have any questions about the plant sale, feel free to add them in the chat, especially if you're interested in volunteering. Raise your hand there and we'll reach out to you and give you some more details about that.
Okay, and I want to say also that I have given Rebecca a link to, oh, I can't start without sharing first. It's always, okay, I could do this. I do this every week. Okay, thing one, thing two. I did send Rebecca a link, and I also put it on the post for my blog site. So if you would like more information about the many topics I'm going to talk about tonight, there is a handout to keep you going. But you don't need it to watch the show. Okay, so tending the soil to tend the plants. Lessons for natives from regenerative agriculture. So can everybody see my screen? Yes, say yes. Okay, yay. And I assume you can hear me also, and there's a ton of people here for this, so that's pretty fun. Okay, so a couple of just pretty slides of diversity of California plants. This is poodle dogbush and Penstemon centranthifolius and Penstemon granelli in the Liebre Mountains. And here is the Carrizo Plain, Galanthus monolopia. Do I even have the right? Yes, I do. Galanthus, monolopia, mentzilia, facilia. In the Temblor Mountains, I think. Well, it's one or the other, the hot or the shaky, the Temblor or the caliente. Anyway, something to look at. And right here, we want to see this Facelia tanacetifolia. And I meant to add another picture, but I didn't. And some prettiness of diversity of garden, Crystal Lake. And this is where I started with this. I read this book, Dirt, in about 2010, as I was preparing to teach for sustainable garden practice for UCLA Extension. And in that, I mean, it's the book here on the left. And he basically says that that the settlers who came here from Europe had destroyed their soil before the Declaration of Independence happened. And part of the Declaration of Independence was to allow them to go west over the mountains in search of new soil to destroy. So that was a depressing thought. And it doesn't actually get better. And so that's David Montgomery there from YouTube. And here's all the people that I stole slides from, or as many of them as I could get on this slide. Besides David Montgomery, it's Dr. Christine Jones, Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, Dr. Chris Nichols, showing glomalin right there, which will come up in a minute, and James White and Dwayne Beck. So, soil degradation doesn't actually get better. Here's degraded soils in the US, and we have lost 5 billion tons of topsoil in the US annually. So this is a question from my class. So if you take my class, you'll know. So that's just a number that I have a really hard time wrapping my head around this number. It's very challenging, but it doesn't get better. In fact, it gets worse. Annually, we lose 24 billion tons of soil lost worldwide. And that soil is the good soil, the soil with the biological activity in the top 2 inches. And this looks like the Dust Bowl, but this on the left is, I thought it was 2014, but it's 2019, this Dust Bowl cloud, and this one is in Washington in 2017. And here is a picture from Oklahoma in 1935, and here's a picture in Oklahoma in 2020. So, so topsoil loss, it's not getting better. And that has consequences. And this is not directly the consequence of this, but it has something to do with it. So in Kansas, I just read this book, 6,000 towns have vanished in the past 80 years. And I read this book in about 2014. So in this book, romance saves the town, but really economics is what is killing the towns. And here, this is not US farm net income, but this does matter. We'll get to why this matters. But so here's the share of agricultural cost, or what is coming into the farms, and down here in red and green is what is staying with the farms. And the difference between the red and green and the blue is the cost of inputs and equipment. So the farmers are not making any money. And so that was Canada, but we can look at median farm income, which is below the line, and we can see median off-farm income. So people have to have jobs to have farms. And this is not a pretty picture. And meanwhile, emissions, carbon emissions, what they don't show in this picture, what they do show is the nitrogen. From whenever you plow, nitrogen gets released into the atmosphere. There's the cows, we know about that. But look how much bigger the nitrogen from soil is in impact than the nitrogen from cows. Okay, so there's manure down here, but we're not going to talk about that. But what they don't show you is that carbon comes out of soils also when soils are plowed. So there's a flush of carbon and nitrogen when a farmer tills, and God bless Ray Archuleta. He says it's like burning down the house to cook a hot dog. So farmers have tilled because their crops do better afterwards, but nothing goes back into the soil, and that is the problem. And so here is a picture from Dr. Cambardella of the soil carbon in a pasture, and then what happens when it is tilled, and then how it comes back to pasture. So this is not new information. The reason there's a sabbatical is because you were supposed to put your land back into pasture every 7 years, according to the Torah, and which is also the Old Testament for Christians, and there are many other traditions that discuss this. So here's a quote from Dwayne Beck. We love him. Tillage is to agriculture what fracking is to petroleum, because the nutrients leave the soil when you till. They flush out into the soil, the plants take them up, but they don't get built back. And so also it destroys soil structure. So here on your left is no-till ecosystem, and on your right is a tilled ecosystem, and this ecosystem doesn't take in water, and this is where dust comes from right here, from those dust storms. And then, but we might have all seen in the news starting last December that planting cover crops will solve the climate, or that we're going to pay for that. And there's a good reason, because farmers who plant diverse cover crops aren't covered by crop insurance. So this is not paying them some more. This is just paying, helping them to stop their losses. So what is a cover crop? It's putting at least one, but often multiple crops onto the ground, versus doing this, which, as we can imagine, is where the soil goes to, and the soil also goes to the Mississippi River and other rivers. So there's an air erosion and there's water erosion, and we can all imagine that. So many of my slides, besides being stolen from the above people, are from SARE and NRCS, which are both US agencies, or SARE is at least funded by the US. And so then we get to soil organic matter, and just want to talk about that. Soils stockpile 1,500 gigatons of carbon, more than Earth's atmosphere and all the plants combined. The majority of soil organic matter is present in the top 10 centimeters of soil. So this will become more obvious why this matters in a minute. And so when I learned about botany, which was quite some time ago, botany as far as, how plants work, as opposed to botany, what plants they are. So I learned that soil carbon was caused by decomposition on the soil surface and decomposition of roots. And it was just all about decomposition. But it turns out that's not really the story. That's a small amount of the story, and not really the best part of the story. So in fact, soil carbon comes from roots in the ground. And I'm going to show you extensive pictures of that. And so my other inspirations, beside all the people prior, Greg Rubin and Bert Wilson, who I never met, but God bless him, he was putting stuff about mycorrhiza on the web in 1994, which predates my interest in native plants. And so Greg would say things, I'll throw a few quotes in, native soils are mycorrhizal, but not bacterial. And I would go, oh, of course. And he would show all these great pictures that I'm going to show you also of what mycorrhiza are. But I didn't understand, and I understood, okay, not bacterial meant not compost. But there's a lot more to that. So we're going to delve deep into that. And so one of my students asked, how come we didn't already know this stuff about mycorrhiza and plants putting carbon into the ground and stuff like that? And so the answer is the model plant is Arabidopsis, sorry. And it's a brassicaceae, and brassicaceae are not mycorrhizal. So a lot of people did a lot of study about a lot of plants, and using the plant that doesn't really represent plants at all. So most plants, except for brassicaceae and beets, some beets, but some Chenopodiaceae or Amaranthaceae, or I don't even know what beets are in right now, are not mycorrhizal, but some are. So they kind of missed a lot of these things for a really long time. And this is the fun part of what they missed is, people would say, when they were simplifying mycorrhiza, they would say, oh, plants trade some of their carbohydrates to microbes, to the mycorrhiza for nutrients, for water. things like that. For minerals, and I didn't realize that nutrients meant nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that. I understood the water and minerals part, but how they do it is plants put out sugar syrup. And I love this picture. And there are people on these soil science conferences who said they have tasted this and it does taste sweet. I'm not really willing to pull a, I guess they've done it with corn plant out of the ground and taste the roots, but people have done it. So this is the carbohydrates. And so this is my favorite picture of all time. There's plenty more pictures, but this one is the most obvious. So how does this work? The sun shines on some leaves, and thanks to this person for making this beautiful, beautiful graphic. I added the sun. So the sun shines on some leaves. The plant makes photosynthate. It builds itself by doing that, but it puts up to 20% of its photosynthate out as sugar syrup to the microbes. And the microbes give back water and nutrients and nitrogen. And so this says mixotrophic, but I think that meant microtrophic. And these little purple lines are interspecific communication, meaning the species are both communicating and acting on each other and trading. So there's a lot going on here. And the mushrooms are often either ectomycorrhiza, which we'll see, and then some of this is also, and then also we have decomposers, which can also be mushrooms. So here's another excellent from someone's paper. Actually, it's referenced below, but so we have our sun, which I added again, soil. We have Frankia, which, as we know, for California natives also fixes nitrogen. We have Rhizobia, which we know fixes nitrogen for lupins and also for clovers and things like that, and other cover crop kind of plants like hairy vetch. Then there's a bunch of bacteria that also fix nitrogen that are just free living. I didn't know that. And then we have over here, we have our fungal people, our buscular mycorrhizal fungi. Sometimes they're called VAM, sometimes they're called AMF. These are our endo, and we'll see that in a minute. And so there are also ectomycorrhiza, ericoid, and arbutoid, just to make it interesting. And so here's some nodules on of Rhizobia on soy. So Frankia also makes nodules on many, many California plants. I don't have pictures of that, but ceanothus, alders, mountain mahogany, there's a whole list, and Las Politas actually has a list, and I should have linked that for you, but I didn't. So Rhizobia and Frankia do the same action, which is they pull nitrogen out of the air and put it in the ground, and then they trade it off to the plants, either by being eaten, I'll show you a picture of this, or by handing it off to the mycorrhiza, which take it to the plant. So this stuff is just really super exciting to me. And so here's a picture of the roots of a plant, and then this zone out here are the mycorrhiza. And for pine seedling, those mycorrhiza are ectomycorrhiza, and that does matter to understand what's going on, the difference between endo and ecto. And so here's endo, and they are also called vesicular, arbuscular, or AMF, depending on who's writing it down. And we love this person who did this beautiful picture and threw it on Wikimedia for us. And those are the arbusculars in there. They thought they looked like trees, so that's why it's called. And those are right inside the plant root cells. The mycorrhiza are inside the cells. And that's some crazy stuff. Beautiful. And moving right along, here's ectomycorrhiza. Instead of being inside the cells, they just cover the roots entirely. So those are the ones you can see with your naked eye, maybe, but you cannot see the endomycorrhiza because their hyphae, which is their like root-like threads, are in fact invisible to the naked eye. So there could be all kind of, people say miles and miles of endomycorrhiza in a teaspoon of soil, and you cannot even see it. I should say right now, which because everyone does, that myco and rhiza are fungus and root, and what I also did not know is most plants needed mycorrhiza to get out of the ocean, and then some of them surrendered it, like the Brassicaceae that we'll see later on, and gave up on mycorrhiza. So that's an interesting concept right there. And then here's from Las Pelides. They had this word explaining this in like 1994, and I have linked that in the handout. And so up here, there your ectomycorrhiza going to the oak, and then below that there's endomycorrhiza. So the oak is using both ecto and endomycorrhiza. So the endomycorrhiza are often found on these other plants, and ecto are often conifers, oaks, things like that, or some of your shrubby natives. I should have made a list for you, but I didn't. But the story gets even more interesting. So I don't have a picture for you of that mycorrhiza with bacteria traveling on them, but they do. But also the roots actually take in bacteria, and the root hairs expel the bacteria. And some of the bacteria breed inside the roots, and some of the bacteria are eaten by the roots. I'm not kidding. So if you want to learn more about that, that to me is mind-blowing and not at all how I ever understood roots. I understood roots to be this straw that just sucked up nutrients from the ground, and so did everyone else. But soil science right now is just fascinating. And this doesn't even go with the part, like I'm not even gonna talk about the part where like creosotes in the desert create calcium carbonate with mycorrhiza. Okay, I should have put that in this talk, but it's a whole bunch of slides already. So so people started finding this, the mycorrhiza, when they started being able to photograph it. And one particular useful mycorrhiza is called glomus, and there's a bunch of them, but one of the easier ones is glomus interradices, which means glomus in the roots. And this mycorrhiza makes glue, and that glue glues soil particles together. So here we have our root, and here we have the glue just starting. And these are these threads and the little dots. And then we have more pictures of threads, and these photos are by Christine Nichols, who was with USDA, and she does have a lot of talks, but what's amazing is she's the one who got these pictures, and I think it's Dr. Christine Nichols anyway. So these are the threads of the hyphae of glomus. And then they aggregate soil around the root. And I've seen this by pulling some grass in the desert at a client's house this year, and I wish I had taken that picture, but I didn't. Anyway, that's important. Okay, going back. So here you have, why does that soil stuck to that root? Why doesn't it just fall off? It's the glomalin, which is the glue from the glomus species. So that's kind of really amazing right there. And then, mycorrhiza won't connect to the plant, or really the plant won't connect to the mycorrhiza if it has too much water or too much fertilizer or too many of its other nutrients. It goes, hey, why should I give up 20% of my photosynthetic income to you if I have all I want? And so this picture is from Dr. Christine Jones, where people were doing a study, and in the study, they put fertilizer in the trench with the plants. I think it might be a wheat plant or a grass plant. But anyway, we see at the top we see our lovely glued together roots and dirt with the mycorrhiza, glued on with the mycorrhiza. Down here, where there was fertilizer, there is no glue and dirt. And so this is the fun thing. And so just keep that in mind while we go along. Then we go to fungal bacterial ratio. So why does this matter? Because bacteria dominated soil is weedy soil. So out here, actually, it starts at like lichens and mosses, and then it goes to weedy plants that aren't really mycorrhizal. Then it goes to perennial weeds and grasses, then shrubs, then, you know, more shrubby things. And then, of course, this was made on the East Coast, so they don't end up with conifers, but over here on our right, there would be conifers. And then here's a different view that shows our conifers in action. So bacteria, a few fungi, balanced, that means you could grow crops there. So that's not for us, for natives. More fungi is kind of where we want to be. And then if we are gardening the forest, well, that's its own question. Should you garden the forest? But so Greg Rubin said this great thing, you know, that I showed before, mycorrhizal, but not bacterial. So that previous slide we see as this kind of shoots and ladders game, or actually, let's just call it a board game. You start here, we go to succession, we go to, you know, our cyanobacteria, so like our desert crust, our weeds, Johnson grass, not a lot of oxygen in the system, then early grasses, then we go to like pasture, beginning to pasture, and then row crops. And when they say native plants, they mean prairie plants in this situation, and then shrubs, and then getting to deciduous trees, and then conifers, and then we go. So this is, you know, a problem that we know, early grasses, bromus, Bermuda, things like that. Then we have, you know, where we would grow our vegetables and row crops, soy and corn and things like that. And so that's 1-to-1 or slightly less. And then here is where at 5-to-1 to 100-to-1, here is where it's really about 10-to-1 is what Las Politas says, of fungi to bacteria. And so everybody's like, why are we looking at this picture of this board game? And the answer is because you can change the behavior of the ground by changing the fungal to bacterial ratio. So if you disturb up here, if you made it all the way to here where natives are happy and you till the soil, it's going to go back here to early grasses and bromes, or even to here, mustard. Right? So mustard, like our Arabidopsis, it's not mycorrhizal. So having lots of mycorrhiza can actually exclude the mustard. But if you disturb, you take the shoot down. If this were shoots and ladders, and we're going to see some ladders, but here's the shoot. If you disturb the soil, you end up at the bad, for us, fungal bacterial ratio. And so we can also take a ladder. We can take a ladder from here to grasses or to vegetables or whatever by not disturbing and by possibly adding mycorrhiza. So this is kind of really fun. And then we could also even take a leap from here, early grasses, to here by how we manage our native planting. And that's, I wish somebody had showed me this. I mean, not that I would have understood it 20 years ago, but I would have really, really, really liked to know. People just said things like fungal to bacterial, and I went, oh, of course it is. And but I did read this early in the early 2000s. And here's a restoration, and they used mycorrhiza, and that's the vesicular arbuscular mycorrhiza, to exclude black mustard. So it was a single species stand of black mustard, and I love this because I know David Pryor from CNPS meetings. and Tree of Life. So we all know them. Although the paper is by this guy, Riefner et al., 1998. And this is not via NRCS. I just took a screenshot of it today. But I do link to it. So basically what they did was they inoculated their, they put mycorrhiza into the ground and inoculated the plants and made the mustard go away in this beach restoration. So that's basically, actually, I'm going to go back. So that's taking the ladder, basically taking our ladder from weeds and going up here by using VAM or AMF, arbuscular, vesicular, arbuscular mycorrhiza, which you can just buy off the shelf. So that's an interesting thing. And so then there's also, Greg would say things like, sow some annuals to reset the system. And I would just nod my head and go, that sounds like that would reset the system. And he meant, he meant native annuals, of course. And we knew this. And I worked in Washington Park where they used a brassica, alyssum as a nurse plant. And we spent years trying to get that out. And it did the opposite of resetting the system. It was a shoot and not a ladder. And so what I didn't know is, and because this work had not necessarily been done then, is these people in Germany have this whole, decades probably now of how diversity in the system creates resilience. So that's an amazing thing. And we go, well, how could that be? And but we have proof that it is. Here's 3 crops sown right next to each other in fields right next to each other in Burleigh County, which is in North Dakota. So not lots of rain, and they didn't get very much rain that particular summer. Burleigh County gets 16 inches of rain on average. So they sowed turnips by themselves. They sowed oilseed radish by themselves. And then they did an 8-way mix. And these fields are right next to each other. And the turnip obviously is suffering. The radish is suffering. And then the cocktail mix that includes turnip and radish is doing fine. And there are pictures of this that I didn't steal from Christine Jones, showing a similar thing with triticale, a wheat on its own, and then a wheat sown with an 8-way mix of cover crops. So how does that work? So one thing is the microbiome knows a lot. And one thing it knows is when there's no plant diversity in a field. And diversity above and below ground creates soil carbon. And why is that? So these great people who I did not link did this paper that shows why. And so if you have one single plant, you have one kind of root exudate. And if you have 2 different plants, and here we have a legume and a probably cereal rye, then you have their exudate plus this exudate plus the mycorrhiza and the bacteria are doing a dance, and you get more than you started with. So 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it equals 3. And per lots of experiments in field trials, in that experiment in Germany, the Jena experiment, and in Burleigh County, which is where a lot of this happened, and other places across the US, people have discovered that instead of taking away, if you plant 8 or 10 or 20 different crops in your field with your main crop, the main crop will do better and it will get the nitrogen it needs, and many, many other things, just by planting diversity. And this doesn't make sense, but this is in fact how it is. And all this, let us remove the weeds. Yeah, because the weeds, some of the weeds are stealers, and they'll come in and take from the mycorrhizal grid and take from the bacteria and take from the existing nutrition. but other plants will contribute to the soil microbe community. So I like to call this my bake sale theory, and I discovered later that other people had used the same metaphor. But basically, if I just only have brownies at my bake sale, I'm just only going to get the microbes that like brownies, or the people, really. But if I have brownies and Rice Krispie treats and chocolate chip cookies and, angel cake, then more people will come to my bake sale and more microbes will come for my bake sale. And then they die and make soil carbon, and that is where soil carbon comes from. And that to me is just wild. And I've spent an entire year since I started learning about this, just cheerfully watching soil science videos because they thrill me to no end. The idea that we could just put carbon into the ground by mixing up our crops is wild to me. And we all say, and so here's another slide from Sarah, showing that we also do get these excellent, birds. We get earthworms. So this all started as people stopped tilling, and then they started putting, leaving stubble on the ground and knocking over stuff on the ground. And they would kill that with basically Roundup. And then after a while, they learned how not to kill it with Roundup, how to use soil, crimpers and things like that. And one thing that I think is really fun is that they also mix in some Phacelia tenicetifolia. I meant to give you a nice picture of that but most of you know this plant. It's commonly sold wildflower, and it's used all over the Midwest right now as part of these diverse crop mixes as an insectary plant. So you get all these wildlife benefits, but it also does, these diverse cover crops do put soil carbon into the ground, and this is wild. And I mean, as we know, if we till this, the carbon goes out, but the idea that it also goes in if we put plants in there is wild. So planting diversity. So as we know, California has lots of diversity, and a lot of it is annual diversity. And here is a picture that I took close to the poppy reserve, and I was trying to take, okay, so I never really did get in this picture how many popcorn flowers there were, but there were a lot of diversity underneath the poppies. So it's not just poppies when you see poppies in a field. And here is some Phacelia and different plants in the Tejon Pass, on the Tejon. And here is diversity at the Santa Rosa Plateau. So I think that's Sidalcia actually, and some Carex and things like that. And I didn't put in all my meadow slides. I could have, but also in this meadow is yarrow and blue-eyed grass and things like that. And some lupins and Engelmann oaks. If you've ever been there, it's really nice. And there's vernal pools and also. And here's a different slide of that, and with the blue-eyed grass and the Carex. And here's some diversity in above Lake Matthews and Riverside. So some coastal sage scrub with some mirabilis and things like that. So nature does plant diversity. And so, and then here is the Tejon again, but more toward the Tehachapi. And this slide is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that me and my friend Bruce and I drive around a lot in wildflower season because he likes to drive and I like to look. No, we like to look at the wildflower. But one thing we see is after something is tilled, we often see an early pioneer plant is the Amsynchia. So that's the Amsynchia in the foreground and poppies here, and then Amsynchia again. And then back here is the problem, tillage. So tillage is, I think, the original sin. I walked around all year saying that. And and this all started because I was teaching this class and was looking for video of the dirt book guy, and he had another video that sent me down the diverse cover crops regenerative agriculture thing. So I did just completely steal this slide and not even reference where it comes from. But a lot of people use this right-hand image. And I think it's interesting because it says legumes are mycorrhizal friendly, so mycotrophic, but not lupins. So lupin is a rhizobial, so a bacterial one. So me and my class were trying to come up with a good cover crop mix, and I'm still not really sure what it would be, but I think that I would include the flax. I would include Bromus carinatus, which is really cheap and available as a cover crop. So California brome. I would include a lot of other things. So I'm still working on that. Probably deerweed also. So here a picture of lupins, pretty close to that other picture, and the Tehachapi on the Tejon. And so lupins are really early pioneer plants. You have to nick them or pour hot water on them because they're going into ground that is very early successional. So I've stopped thinking that I want to plant lupins when I'm looking for a later successional thing. But here is a picture of flax just for fun. And so what are the lessons for us? I promised that in this talk. And there are a bunch of other ideas about regenerative agriculture, but for native plants. Thing one is do not disturb. Thing two is cover the soil. So mycorrhizae do not like to be in the direct sunlight. And that can help them. And also it helps with the do not disturb portion of things. And number three is plant diversity. So that's both a command and a description. You should plant diversity, and there should be diversity in your plants. So do not disturb. So people say, oh, well, it's too compacted. I have to till it or fork it. Or the guys, honestly, the guys I work with, they'll go through and in order to smooth out a situation or a yard, they will go through and just chip into that top layer of soil. And it's clear that native plants do not need that. Here's penstemon, I think it's Granelli in a rock. And people used to say, oh, plants secrete carbonic acid. But no, they might secrete carbonic acid just to get a foothold. But then they are bringing in all those microbes. So spores are just in the air. Do you have to go and buy some mycorrhizae? No, the spores are in the air. They're going to find that plant and go to their roots. And the spores are also on the seed. So you don't want to treat your seed or use treated seed at all, even for your vegetables. That would be a bad idea. So cover the soil. This is, how to get rid of weeds without tilling. So this is covering Bermuda, and then there's cardboard under there, and I don't show that in this deck, but there's cardboard on top of mulch, and then we wait, 2 months so that we don't pull on the Bermuda, because that would create conditions that Bermuda favors, because it would be going down a chute back to that early weedy grasses thing. And then we cut right into the cardboard and put those plants in, and we make a hole the exact size of the can. We do not fluff the dirt up. We do not build a big hole around the plants. Like people say, dig a $50 hole for a $5 plant. No, dig a hole the exact size of the plant, because you want it to connect to those mycorrhizae right now, and stick the plant, just slide that plant into the hole, into the ground. And then plant diversity, but here, here's the mulch on top of a new job. Maybe this might be 6 months later. Actually, I think we planted this job in the spring. So this would be almost a year later, but put down the mulch, and then we just throw wildflowers, California native annuals right into it. And then here's a different semi-perennial, but you can see it has some Clarkia and Guiculata behind there, and there's some yarrow in this picture, and some poppies also. So a nice diverse mix. Of course, the wildflower is a Brassicaceae, but it didn't seem to affect this. I think if they're native, they might be better behaved. I don't really know. There's a lot I don't know about this, so we'll see what I don't know when we get to the questions. But here is at the Learning Garden, a bunch of Clarkia. I think this is actually just a different view of that. But so monkey flower and Clarkia and poppies and Artemisia and all the things. And then here's up in Big Bear, a wildflower meadow that was just made from seed. And this is amazing. It also contains some shrubs, but not in this picture. And same place with some sulfur flowered buckwheat, some yarrow, Penstemon labrosus, which I wish was available, but wishes were horses, and poppies. And mostly because the Penstemon labrosus makes a colony, so you don't have to seed it over and over. And then different, this is that Baja Salvia Astata, maybe. I'm just guessing from the leaves, actually, and some lupin and some Mimulus puniceus, and then of course our poppies. So, and then here we have, planting. This is a couple years after this went in, but we had the shrubs, the wildflowers are still there. There were a ton of, this went in with mostly rainbow mix on top of our shrubs. And I have to say, if I were trying to just start a native garden in a really weedy place, I would probably start with buckwheats if it were sunny, and throw my native annuals on top of that. If I really felt like I just wanted this succession to happen. But of course, I would probably actually mix in all the plants that I'm interested in. Of course, Ceanothus is also an early successional plant. And if you have all these things along with your amazing manzanitas and other plants, things will do better. Okay. And then a couple films that you can find. And I'm gonna keep the slides live while I take questions. So I'm sure there will be like a zillion questions, or maybe 2 zillion, because I think I've made my case, but I'm not sure.
You definitely have some questions, Orchid.
Okay.
Peggy Burhan actually had a good one. Peggy, are you available to ask the question out loud?
Oh, sure. Hi, Orchid. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm just curious. I want to do what you're saying, get like this going in my yard. Were you suggesting you put down the cardboard and then you put seeds on top of that and mulch on top of that? Or is this separate gardens that you're talking about?
I say, yeah, so the cardboard and mulch is really just, is if you have Bermuda grass, we put cardboard under the mulch. If you don't, we don't. So I will tell a quick story about that. I do have online a whole thing of how to do that on my blog site, which if you just Google me and native plants, you'll find it. I had some friends who wanted native design. They knew their plants, but design wasn't their best thing. And they were young and they had a house, but no money. And she was pregnant. So they couldn't, what we did before this job was we used to go in and just dig out the Bermuda. I'm not kidding, every last piece. And as we can see, that was not the right thing to do. So they weren't gonna spray for it because, we worked at the Audubon Center. They weren't gonna dig for it because she was pregnant and they didn't have the money to pay for labor for someone else to dig. So I said, okay, well, I've heard of this thing that in this permaculture class that I took, and we could just pile cardboard on top of it and mulch. And we did that. They did it by themselves. And we came back to planting day. So they did that over the summer, late summer to fall. We came back, and this very vigorous Bermuda was just a few little strings left of very weakened Bermuda that you could just actually pull out with your hands. And that's when I stopped really chasing Bermuda. I never chased Bermuda again. So that's really only for a very difficult weed situation. Although I might try it for other weed situations, like I might try it for Oxalis pes capre, Bermuda buttercup. Yeah, we don't do it all the time. Mostly we just lay down mulch and wait until fall if we start and we have bare ground. Now I think I would just not even leave any bare ground for any time. We would just do any removals we need to do and then put out our plants. So there is no time when there isn't a living root in the ground. That's kind of one of the regenerative agricultural principles, is living root in the ground all the time to feed the microbes. Does that make sense? Peggy,
Yes, thank you.
okay. More questions?
Yeah, next up, we've got Cynthia Artish with a related question as well.
Yes.
Hi, Orchid. I've taken your class before, and thank you for this great presentation. So I've been doing habitat restoration in my native garden, and I bumped into a couple of questions about mulch. We have solitary bees that nest in the ground, and so I noticed we don't want to just mulch everything, because that would wipe out their habitat. And I was just wondering, what's the best kind of mulch to use? Because there's some thought as to some wood mulch taking nutrients out of the soil. And so is there a special kind of mulch? I think arborist mulch is what is preferred, but where do you get that? And what do you think of that?
Okay, so let's start with the bees. First, before you mulch, you should go find where the bees are.
Yeah.
And so my understanding, so I went round and round with Gordon Franke, the bee guy at Berkeley, about this, and got some help from Mickey. So, Gordon Franke, he's not a land manager. And so he doesn't weed himself. He has graduate students for that. But what I have kind of come up to, or what people have said that makes sense to me, is that you'll see bees are often on the east side. Your solitary ground dwelling bees are often to the east side of the property, where the ground can warm up the earliest, or wherever in your property the ground will warm up the earliest in the day. So you want to find that, and you will find your bees. And I, in fact, did that, and I did find them on my property, and I was so pleased with myself.
You're right.
You can, do a search first for the bees, and don't mulch them. They won't be happy with that. Then second, it doesn't really matter. I mean, honestly, the mulch stealing the nutrients is a hotly debated subject, but native plants are not looking for high nutrients. And by nutrients, we mean high nitrogen. They're not looking for that high nitrogen situation. So if the mulch decomposition ties up some nitrogen, it's not a problem for natives. They don't care. They'll get the nitrogen they need from connecting to the mycorrhiza. Does that make sense?
It does. Great. Thank you.
So I like to use shredded cedar mulch. Greg Rubin likes to use shredded redwood mulch. Cedar is really local, so for me that often works. But any shredded arborist mulch is fine as long as it is weed free, and that is often debatable. But we are not looking for compost because compost is on the wrong side of the bacterial fungal ratio. Okay, more questions.
We didn't have any others queued up, but if anybody wants to raise their hand or just unmute themselves and ask, now's a great time.
Can you talk about, Orchid, this is Michelle, can you talk about why not to use compost? That was a very good comment that you just made, just so we have a better understanding.
Okay, so I'm gonna shrink all of you people down and I'm gonna go backwards, and that's why I left the slide show up. And so I'm gonna go back to the fungal bacterial ratio, and that's because compost is bacterial. It's super simple. So, and it's not fungal. It is possible in theory to make fungal compost, and there's a guy out of Chico who makes very undisturbed, like wood chip compost. And people have figured out an easier way to do that. You know, I don't know how to evaluate it. But basically, if you add compost, you're going to be back here, down here at the, sorry, let's see. Okay. We're going to be back here at, no, okay, back to fungal bacteria. There I am. Okay. So if we look here, a compost has a higher bacterial than fungal. So its fungal bacterial is going to be less than 1. Since we want to be up here at 10:1, if we add compost, or too much compost, I would say, I mean, in theory, you could add just a little compost if things are not bacterial or are not, you know, if you had really, really bare, like if they took the topsoil off your site, and you wanted to do kind of slower succession, or you just didn't have anything going at all. But if you wanted to start with natives, it would be better to plant natives that have been inoculated with mycorrhiza, and then plant wildflowers on top of that, so that you're up here in 5:1 to 101:1, because if you add too much compost to your ground, you're going to be down here in weeds. Does that make sense as you listen to it?
Yes.
Okay, so it's all about the fungal bacterial ratio, and why, you know, why did Greg Rubin say that? This is why. So basically answering these questions for myself, and I figure you all might also like to know.
Did you say if the soil is bare, you should plant natives that are already in pots, or if it's bare, you put the mulch and the seeds first, or do you put the mulch and the growing natives?
If the soil was bare, if I was starting on a bad site, I would buy some plants from Las Politas or Tree of Life directly.
Oh, okay.
In pots, I would put them in the ground. I
Okay.
would put the mulch on top, and
Okay.
then into the mulch, I would sow not our rare wildflowers, but really common ones like Clarkia, and I would sow a mix. So, you know, we would do this and it would work, but we would not know why. And so this talk for me is part of trying to answer the why. Why did that work? You know, why did that work for me? And other people were like, you can't even do that. And the answer is mulch is often a lot like potting soil, honestly. You know, and so, you know, why can't you have manure in your mulch? Like lots of mulches are composted with manure. Well, because it's too far back in the bacterial succession and the bacterial fungal succession. So too many bacteria, not enough fungi. Right. So yeah. So if I had perfectly bare, they scraped all the topsoil off, new construction on a, you know, on a new land development, so not even any mycorrhiza next door. I would probably plant ceanothus and buckwheat, honestly, are early successional things that you see by the freeway. And annuals on top of that. Oh, and deerweed and things like that. And Bromus carinatus, California brome. And so I am just making this up right now. So thank you for asking these questions, because I'll watch myself later and write all that down.
Thank you.
You're
Orchid,
welcome.
we've got a whole bunch of questions lined up now. I shouldn't have maybe opened it.
Yeah.
But it's great, right? So Susan Fleming had a few questions, and particularly was asking for some resources.
Okay, so the resources for understanding this, I put in a handout. That handout is on my website at nativesanctuary.wordpress.com, and I also shared it to Rebecca. And I know that there is some way to email that to everyone, but I don't really know what that is. And I don't know if the chapter actually knows. So I will put in the chat how to find this.
Yeah, I just put your handout in the chat.
Okay, look, see, everyone can get this right now. Go get it. You can click on a link in the chat and it will open the link for you. So this is, you know, a bunch of YouTubes basically of soil science conferences and different links where you can see what I saw, although you may not get exactly what I got, because I was looking at it from a perspective of how does this involve native plants, which they don't really talk about too much. I mean, they're planting Phacelia across the Midwest. It's not native out there. And they're planting our Phacelia, but I think it works really well in the cover crop mixes. Okay, next question.
So, Orchid, this is Susan. First of all, this is an awesome presentation. And I had just read Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is all about mycorrhiza. And, yeah. But I'm very interested in two questions. One that are more practical. Do you have a list? You gave us a few plants in showing your shoots and ladders diagram and succession. Is there anywhere we can find a complete list of plants in succession for their more complete, especially native plants and their successional needs?
You know, I would start on the Las Politas website and just start reading their, they have 3 pages. One I didn't put in the handout on Frankia and what has the Frankia associations, and 2 on mycorrhiza, and I would start there. But no, as far as I know, no one has, okay, it would be great if someone had made this list. I'm willing to try to make this list. I mean, it's different for natives because for a lot of our disturbances, for example, fire is a major disturbance for our natives. We have plants in the ground, you know, the burl forming, resprouting plants are keeping the mycorrhiza alive because they are alive. And then, you know, we have our annuals and then our short-lived perennials, things like, you know, the flax doesn't live a long time. The deerweed, you know, I would bet the monkey flowers, honestly, because they're short-lived too, and you see them just hanging out of rock. But again, I'm just kind of pulling this out of thin air while I think about it. Maybe somebody has done a native plant succession list, but I didn't find it, you know, in my travels of making this, although I didn't exactly look for it either. So if I find one, I'll post it on my site. But otherwise, yeah, I don't really have one for you. You know, my early attempts were obviously incorrect. So me and some students last summer were trying to come up with what would that be, and so we did kind of come up with Bromus carinatus and deerweed, and I think the penstemons and probably the monkey flowers too, honestly. And things that are kind of short-lived, but also, you know, your buckwheats and your ceanothuses and all the Frankia people, the Frankia hosting plants, you know, alders. Alders come up right at the beginning of, you know, if there's enough water. Okay. But in northern forests and the tree harvest people cut them down instead of letting them go. Or, but this also explains, I just want to say, the really bad planting that that the Forest Service did after the station fire that an oil company paid for, and Chad Hansen talks about this, about how forest restorations often don't work, but you know, when the forest restores itself, it often works really quickly. And I started realizing, of course, if someone goes in and does a forest restoration, they clear out all the logs, they destroy the mycorrhiza in the top couple inches of everything, and then they throw some plants in the ground, and then they remove all the ceanothus. So they're doing, you know, exactly all the things that we say not to do in this talk. And so when and I'll try and get him for this for a program, because he has a great program on, you know, how forests recover after fire and all the birds that use the different trees. And you can also find him on YouTube. But the part that's interesting to me is, you know, why those restorations didn't work. I mean, pine trees go there. Why shouldn't you just be able to put a lot of pine trees in the ground? Well, you know, they grow with all these different associated things. And if you have an old school idea that those things are competing instead of cooperating to put sugars and nutrients in the ground, and the big trade and basically a giant underground market that's going on, if you just see your other natives as competitors and remove them, well, it's not going to fly. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And yeah, I'm not an expert in that at all, but it occupies my thoughts. Any more questions? Yes.
Okay, I'm going to actually read out a few questions to you really quickly, just because there were a whole mess of them. One was, what do you use compost for?
Vegetables.
Perfect. Can you do the cardboard and mulch smothering method at any time of the year?
Works best in summer, but yes, you can. And the reason it works is because it excludes light to the Bermuda. Bermuda doesn't grow in shade. If you make it grow in shade, it'll run around under the cardboard until it exhausts itself. So I do have a whole post on that on my website. And you can, I mean, it's the post that people worldwide come to that site for. It has very little to do with natives, but you know, how to do it. So yes, you can do it at any time. Summer is a great time because, you know, Bermuda is a warm season grass. And if you make it really hard for it to grow in summer, then it's going to sulk until it's really, really easy to just grab it and pull it out.
Great. And then mulch types. The free mulch that you can get from City of LA sites are mostly wood chips. Is that a decent mulch to use?
Yeah, so wood chips are. I will say that David King at the Learning Garden, who teaches with me, or he's the one who forced me to teach and gave me a copy of PowerPoint. He has gotten some bad weeds from the free city mulch, which they bring him for free. I mean, they even deliver it to him. So, but in general, if it doesn't look weedy at all, if it just looks like, you know, if it's arborist mulch, because, you know, they're doing a lot of tree trimming and maybe some trimming that they shouldn't, but anyway, that's not my problem. And then, yeah, if it's just arborist, then it would be fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Next, are oak leaves okay to compost with? And should we leave dead plants in the ground and just cut off the tops?
Okay, yes and yes. In fact, that's how I deal with Bermuda buttercup, Oxalis pes capri. Even living, I just run around and we cut off all the tops. And we have one at a site that was really, really difficult with that, just by not ever disturbing the soil. So yeah, I wouldn't pull them out except for maybe mustard. And that one is a more difficult one. I've gone around and around with Bruce about this. He uses a claw hammer to pull out those really big mustards. But I also think that maybe people who do like trail building and trail restoration, I mean, they're not doing trail restoration, trail building, should really think about maybe adding some mycorrhiza to their site as per that San Onofre paper. And so, because if you're going to go in, you're going to build a trail, and then you're just going to cause a bunch of disturbance that allows the mustard to come in. And yes, you have to maintain your trail so people don't fall off the edge. And I'm really, really grateful for all the people who do that. But they are introducing disturbance. So I think there should be ways to fix it. And I feel like that is probably the right way. And then I answered the mulch question, I think.
I think so.
Okay.
We also had a question that I assume is meant for the average homeowner, average person. Can you buy fungal additive?
Okay, so here's the thing is, I feel like the fungal additive, yes, you can buy it. You can just buy it at mycorrhiza.com. And they did probably just buy it for that restoration, and there are other restoration. And people do buy it for crops. They buy that glomus. So, and I think for crops, it does make sense because you're just trying to get a harvest this year. I think, honestly, unless you're doing restoration where you're not planting, that you should buy it. Mycorrhiza live on roots and they exist in the air. And so every reputable, I mean, that story about San Onofre, that was Tree of Life in 1994, and Las Politas. And honestly, if I were really fixing difficult land, I would buy some Las Politas plants and then fill in with Tree of Life plants just for the manzanitas and ceanothus. But Tree of Life has a solid mycorrhizal program. So do you need to buy it? No, it's in the air right now. You probably have just breathed in some mycorrhiza while we were talking. It's in the air, it's in the ground. There are situations where, the ground could be really impacted, but it's going to be happier if it's on some roots, and it will be on some roots in the plants that you buy, whether that's at the Theodore Payne sale tomorrow or at our sale in a week. Buy the plants where the mycorrhiza is living. It's not spores, it's living on the plant when you buy it, and it goes into the ground and starts that whole process that I showed.
Excellent. Thank you, Orchid. You've answered a lot of other questions in the answers to some of those, which is great. And then this is actually something that I've seen on a few sites. We have somebody in the group who has been mulching their yard for long enough that their yard just keeps going higher and higher. So their plants are kind of sinking in relation to the rising mulch piles. Is that a good idea? Is there something different to be done?
Okay, so you need the mulch to get the plants going, but after a while, the plants should mulch themselves. And if you prune your plants, you should just cut up the prunings right then. So, I mean, unless you have a crazy weed problem where the weeds are blowing in from next door, the mulch is really there to start the process of things being covered. And, if you have a difficult slope, you probably want to keep it mulched. If you have a flat landscape where all the bush canopies are touching each other, the mulch stops being as important, right? Because it's going to be cooler there. I didn't show a bunch of temperature slides, but there are some. And so no, and mulch also cannot touch the plant stem, right? Because it's decomposing. All those saprophytic fungi are doing their job and helping feed the other fungi, but you don't want them to be saprophytic all over your plant stem and decompose it. So I'm not sure, I could stop the share and do a whiteboard, but usually we put the mulch at least as far from the plant stem as the stem was from the edge of the can or the pot, really. They used to be actually literally be canned at the indoor pan a long time ago. So that's what we say in the can, but we mean in a pot. Does that make sense?
It does to me. I think that question came from S. Swift. Do you think you got that answer?
Yes, that's really interesting because I've just been mulching every year and I guess I can just stop now because my plants are getting big and I can just stop doing that in places where the plants are covering the ground.
Right, so the plants should give you enough litter for it to work. And if they don't, I would just be sparing about that and maybe buy it in bags instead of in truckloads.
Got it. Thank
So-
you.
So
So-
then you're also allowing all of your associated ground dwelling insects and things like that to have a chance as well. I mean, basically a pile of mulch is for our early succession of everything and not for the later. So we need the rest of that biodiversity to also happen, and that includes the insects and the arthropods and every other thing. So and I do really think that also accounts for the native bee problem and things like that. So there you go.
Thank you.
Well, I think you covered almost all the questions, Orchid.
Yay,
Thanks so much for your presentation tonight.
you are welcome.